capitalism. You can sell anything you want, and then buy anything without money. It's a fair and simple way to trade commodities. It's perfect. Until it isn't. So here we encounter Marx's first big critique of capitalism. Not only does it seem like it's not sustainable, but it can be taken advantage of. And thus begins the era of exploitation.
Okay, Das Kapital, Capital, Week 2. It was inevitable that it would start talking about the corruption of the system and how people could take the system out from its intended context and use it for personal gain. So far I've only read like 10 pages and it's already packed with so much info about this. It's interesting. Part 1 was so definitional. This feels a little bit more substantive. He describes that the first appearance of capital are commodities after going through circulation. So he totally flipped the script on the commodity turns into money, turns back into a commodity where you're selling in order to buy, and made it so you're buying in order to sell. MCM. And as he describes, that means that the money is always potential capital, even from the first stage of the transaction. And now I see why he's not like an Instagram business influencer.
25 bucks. Give it to me, Lily. Rio from Tiger, 2004. Let's see what it's worth. 20 bucks all day.
Sneaker reselling has taken a crazy turn within just the past couple of years.
As the world talks more and more about the importance of reselling, whether it's in the sneaker industry or even just in garage sailing, Marx is trying to expose the negative sides of that so people can understand the true weight that doing those types of transactions can have. Rather than the end goal being a commodity to fulfill some sort of a want or a need and have a real use value, the end goal, of course, becomes money itself. So there is only exchange value. There's no use value. It ends up being entirely quantitative. In fact, the commodity itself doesn't even matter what it is. And that's what I kind of noticed with all these Amazon resellers. The object itself is always really strange, right? But it doesn't matter, because if people are at all willing to buy it, it's gonna work for your transaction. And ideally, of course, you're gonna want what he calls a surplus value, which is the profit. In fact, I really loved his quote on how if you buy something for 100 pounds and then sell it for 100 pounds, then it's really absurd. One of the reasons this book is a little long-winded, but I appreciated it. But I think the most important point that he makes so far in this section is how the movement in these types of transactions, the movement of that money, becomes entirely interminable. It's endless. Instead of there being an end goal of using a commodity, you're constantly growing. And it once again drives home the point that capitalism never can rest. And this is the point where Marx starts painting capitalists as the villains, saying that the real aim of capitalists could never be the use value, only the exchange value, only the profit. Going as far as to say capitalists are rational misers. He even starts using the same tactic I mentioned last response, using the words of people with notoriety that most people trust as a way to validate what he's saying. He quotes Benjamin Franklin, saying that commerce in general is all about cheating, especially the producers being cheated by the merchants. And Aristotle, who also says that it's a form of mutual cheating, and vilifying the idea that money is the end goal by saying that that was not money's original purpose, saying that the original intention of money was to allow consumers to purchase products that they could get a use out of. It almost feels like Marx is trying to grab at too many places here. However, I do want to mention that he used the words prima facie when describing the MCM view, suggesting that it's his initial impression of it and that it's still a work in progress, showing a little bit more vulnerability. Though I lose that sense quickly when he starts talking about surplus value. He mentions that in these transactions, that their end goal is just to get a surplus. There is a lurking quid pro quo. It makes it look a lot more nefarious than just trying to grow a business, find financial success, and it again drives home the idea that this is just cheating. But then he goes into how that surplus itself is created. Because just like I mentioned in the last response, the law of conservation of matter once again comes into play here. He says while in circulation, you can't just magically create value. He does mention that before you put something in circulation, for example, you can turn leather of a certain value into a boot of a certain value. But you're not increasing the value of the leather, you're just creating new commodity. And once that is in circulation, there's a pool of value, of the labor more of the price, and you can't change that. The only thing that can happen is it's distributed differently. You take more of the pie, you don't create more pie. So I was thinking that I understood it until this line. Throughout the entire section, he's hinted at where capital itself comes from. At first, I interpreted it as either being a commodity or the money that goes through circulation, and being in that process of circulation creates that capital. Because in the end, it has an end goal rather than just sitting as its own thing. Capital must have its origin both in circulation and yet not in circulation. Therefore, we have a double result. Okay, hold on. After much discussion, I think I have an idea of what capital is. So looking at that capitalist machine, the endless cycle of money turning into commodities, turning back to money, and never stopping, you can see that every time one of those exchanges happen, there is a relationship created. But that's only for one type of commodity. In any realistic scenario, there are going to be a ton of different ones. So now we have two machines running parallel, and there are relationships constantly being created for both. But even with all that, just the relationships between those exchanges still don't count as capital. Because in order to actually get capital, we need to connect those two relationships together, finding the relationship between the relationships of each commodity. So just because someone owns a lot of money, or even commodities for that matter, it doesn't mean that they have a lot of capital. What allows someone to constantly create that capital is having the means and mode of production in the first place. And that doesn't just mean the raw and temporary materials, it means the labor that goes into it and the ability to constantly keep that machine going, because there is no physical manifestation of capital itself. If I'm looking at this right, I see capital as potential, constantly on the verge of creating something new. So if production stops, no more capital. I think I get it, but I want to finish off by talking about how that cycle actually takes place. And I'm of course talking about the working day. First of all, while describing all of this, he really paints that villain picture more clearly than ever. Not only does he quite literally call the capitalist moneybags, but he explicitly describes the capitalist as having importance, smirking, and having an intent on business. And then says the laborers are timid and holding back, always hiding. It sounds like it's from a storybook, which kind of abolishes the biggest thing that people describe when they talk about capitalism, which is individuality. So once the work starts, he is certain that there is always a surplus of work. He even described the working day as being a combination of necessary labor and surplus labor, and describing that the surplus work is disguised by wages throughout the day. When I first saw this, I thought, okay, sure, the first 50% of the day covers all the value that is being put back into the factory. So that's where the traditional necessary labor ends. But isn't the remainder just covering the constant and variable capital, like the machinery and the cost of the building? Marx actually addresses this and said that that's entirely false, because the only value that these laborers can make is entirely new. Like he said before, you can't add value to something, just create new value of some other commodity. So he's completely destroying the idea that there's any real value to this surplus work other than the benefit of the factory owner. But as he explores, these villainous capitalists can't just push their workers forever. After describing that the working day itself is very variable, saying that it's both determinable but also indeterminate, and I honestly can't tell if that's profound or just contradictory, but he splits the day into two limitations. First, the physical ones, the need for food and rest, and interestingly also includes the social bounds, which include the moral side that he talked about before, fostering relationships, having time to intellectually explore. And I think the fact that he's taking that into account shows his real reasoning behind this whole book. Inherently, these limitations are being threatened by those who own capital, and he sees that as extremely inhumane. All in all, capping it off by saying that the working day is a struggle between the capitalists and the working class, restoring that sense of separation that he's talked about from the very beginning. So I definitely need to do more research, but as of now, it's really interesting seeing that all of his writing is really just to better humanity. He's worried about the future of pretty much every country at this time. Marx was a fearful man who tried to do something about it, and that's just the beginning of week 2.